What you're about to hear forces a question most people avoid entirely, because if even a fraction of it is true, then the world is not what you were told it is. Not even close. Because when a priest who has performed hundreds of exorcisms says, there are moments he cannot explain, moments that made him question the limits of human psychology itself, you don't just dismiss that. You follow it to its conclusion, even if it leads somewhere uncomfortable. And the most disturbing part is not what happened in the room. It's what was already waiting in the room before anyone spoke, because long before the prayers began, long before the ritual words were even spoken, something was already aware, watching, waiting. And according to the testimony of a Catholic priest who lived through it, it knew him personally, not as a stranger. As if it had been studying him for years, and that single detail is where everything starts to break away from what most people think they understand about reality. Because this isn't just a story about possession. It's a story about recognition, about something that looked at a human being and didn't just see flesh or psychology or trauma, but identity. A priest who has publicly spoken about these experiences is Chad Ripperger, a man trained not in superstition, but in theology rooted in centuries of structured philosophy and doctrine, including the metaphysical framework of St. Thomas Aquinas, who argued that spiritual intelligences are not bound by physical processes the way human minds are. But none of that academic structure prepares anyone for what happens when theory becomes contact. Because contact is different. Contact is personal. And according to his account, there was a moment in one exorcism where everything shifted, not gradually, not symbolically, but instantly, as if something inside the possessed person stopped pretending. The room didn't feel like a room anymore. It felt like an audience had just been acknowledged. And the priest says it spoke, not in broken sounds, not in confusion, but in precision. It used knowledge it should not have had, private knowledge, height knowledge. And then it crossed a line that turned the encounter from disturbing to unforgettable. It called him by a name that was never publicly known, a baptismal name. A detail sealed in spiritual privacy, something never shared outside sacred confession and clerical boundaries. And that is where the logic of normal explanations begins to fail. Because coincidence can explain a lot of things, but it cannot explain targeted intimacy with details that were deliberately concealed. And what makes the moment even more unsettling is what followed it. Not violence, not chaos, but conversation. Because the intelligence behind the phenomenon didn't behave like something blind or reactive. It behaved like something studying reaction itself. Like it wanted to see what the knowledge would do. And according to accounts tied to these experiences, that is a consistent pattern across severe cases, not random noise. But directed engagement, which leads to the question nobody wants to ask too directly. If something knows you, what exactly is it watching? And how long has it been watching before you ever walked into the room? That question becomes heavier when you understand how exorcists describe the lead-up to possession cases. They do not typically begin with dramatic events. They begin with small openings, moments that feel meaningless at the time, decisions that seem harmless, curiosities that feel temporary. And over time, according to long-standing Catholic exorcism tradition within the Catholic Church, those openings accumulate into something structured, something that behaves less like randomness and more like access being granted, which is where the narrative becomes difficult to ignore, even for skeptics, because the pattern being described is not chaos, it is consistency. Not every case is extreme. But the extreme cases, the ones that end in full exorcism rites, follow a recognizable progression. First comes exposure, then repetition, then attachment, and finally escalation. But what makes escalation terrifying in these accounts is not just the physical manifestations people imagine from films. It is intelligence. Because in the reports shared by priests like Chad Ripperger, the most unsettling element is not strength or violence. It is knowledge, specific knowledge, personal knowledge. The kind that feels impossible to acquire through normal means. And that is where another referenced expert enters the conversation, not as a believer in theology, but as a clinician, psychiatrist. Richard Gallagher has documented cases in which he concluded that the behavior he observed in certain individuals could not be easily explained through standard psychiatric frameworks alone. That does not confirm supernatural causation, but it does complicate the assumption that everything fits neatly into material explanation. And complication is where curiosity begins to deepen, because once you admit that not everything is fully explained, you are forced to sit with uncertainty. And uncertainty, in this context, becomes the real tension holding the entire subject together. But the story being told here does not stay in uncertainty for long. It escalates. Because the priest's account describes a moment where the phenomenon did something more specific than anything before it. It didn't just react. It identified. It referenced a personal fear he had never spoken aloud, a childhood memory buried so deeply that even conscious recollection was uncertain. And yet, in the middle of a ritual intended to confront spiritual presences, that memory surfaced, spoken back to him not as guesswork, not as psychological reading, but as direct reference. And that is where the psychological interpretation starts to strain. Because even advanced observation cannot access something that has never been externalized in behavior, speech, or documentation, which leaves only two possibilities people tend to argue about. Either the human mind is far more externally readable than science currently understands, or the intelligence being described is not limited to human constraints of perception, and neither explanation is comfortable, because both imply that reality is larger than assumed, and once that idea takes hold, the entire structure of what is possible begins to shift. But what makes this story even more unstable is what comes next in his account, because the moment that knowledge revealed, something else changed in the room. The atmosphere shifted from observation to confrontation, as if the act of recognition itself triggered resistance. And the priest describes a very specific sensation, something like pressure, not physical but perceptual, as though attention itself had weight. And in that moment, the dynamic changed. No longer observer and subject. Now opposition, which leads directly into one of the most controversial claims in all exorcism literature, that these encounters are not random outbursts, but structured engagements governed by rules that respond to authority. And in Catholic theology, that authority is not personal power, but delegated spiritual authority believed to operate through sacramental structure within the Catholic Church. Which means, according to that framework, the exorcist is not acting alone. He is acting within something larger. But even that framework does not fully explain what was reported in this specific case. Because when the ritual intensified, when the commands were spoken, something unexpected happened. The entity responded, not with chaos, but with resistance that felt strategic, as if it was evaluating the structure of the ritual itself, testing boundaries, probing force, weakness. And that is the detail that changes everything, because it implies adaptation, learning, adjustment under pressure. And if that is accurate, then the encounter is not static. It is interactive, which raises a terrifying implication. The priest himself does not soften in his testimony. If something can observe, learn, and respond in real time during confrontation, then it is not merely reacting to the present moment. It is building understanding of the person confronting it, and that leads to the final moment in this part of the account, the moment he says, everything nearly broke. Because during the ritual, as resistance increased, the voice shifted again. And this time, it did not simply speak about him. It addressed him directly, in a way that felt deliberate, structured, and personal, as if the goal was not just to resist the ritual, but to destabilize the one performing it. And what it said next is where the story stops being something you can easily categorize as theological or psychological or symbolic, because it referenced something only he and God were supposed to know. And in that instant, according to his account, the certainty he had built over years of training, theology, and preparation did something it had never done before. It cracked, not completely, but enough that the ritual did not continue smoothly. Enough that attention fractured, and in exorcism accounts, that moment of fracture is everything, because what happens next determines whether authority holds or slips. And what followed that moment was not resolution, it was escalation, because the entity, now aware that it had affected him, did not stop. It pushed further, as if testing what else could be uncovered, what else could be reached. And the priest describes a sensation that would later define his understanding of these encounters. The feeling that nothing about him was fully hidden, not memory, not fear, not identity. And that realization leads directly into what he would later call the most important discovery of his entire ministry. That the real battlefield was not the room. It was information. What is known, what is exposed, what can be used, and what remains hidden until it isn't. But what he learned next would go even deeper than that. Because the hierarchy behind these encounters, according to his later reflections, suggests that what he faced was not the lowest level of influence, not even close. It was something that had structure, intention, and patience, and that raises the question that will define everything in part 2. If something has been watching and learning and waiting, then what exactly does it want next? And more importantly, how long has it been preparing for it? If something has been watching a human being long before the moment of confrontation, then the real question is no longer about what it knows in the present. The real question becomes what it has already decided about the future. Because according to the account we've been following, this intelligence does not behave like something improvising. It behaves like something that prepares. And preparation implies intent. Because once the priest realized that the entity was not only reacting but recognizing, the entire structure of the encounter changed. What looked like a ritual of expulsion began to feel like something closer to a contest of awareness, where every word spoken carried consequences beyond the immediate moment, as if language itself was being weighed, tested, and turned back on the one who spoke it. In the theology of the Catholic Church, exorcism is not a battle of imagination, but a structured invocation of authority believed to operate through divine order. That structure is rooted in centuries of philosophical reasoning, including the metaphysical framework developed by St. Thomas Aquinas, who described spiritual intelligences as beings capable of direct intellectual apprehension rather than step-by-step reasoning, which, if taken seriously, leads to an unsettling implication. If such intelligences exist, then they do not need time to figure things out the way humans do. They simply know. And knowing, in the context of confrontation, becomes dangerous when it is directed toward a specific individual, because in the priest's account, the shift did not remain abstract. It became personal again, but this time more precise, more targeted, as if the entity had moved past general observation and into something closer to mapping. It was no longer just speaking about fears or memories. It was organizing them, connecting them, arranging them in a way that suggested intent rather than randomness. And that is where the psychological interpretation begins to struggle. Because psychological reading requires observable signals, behavioral leakage, patterns that can be inferred from external cues. But what was being described in this case went beyond inference. It reached into areas that had never been externalized at all, at least not in any conscious or detectable form. Which is why, in the testimony of Chad Ripperger, the most disturbing element was not physical manifestation, but informational precision, because precision suggests access, and access suggests proximity. Not physical proximity, but something far more invasive in implication. Awareness without interaction. The moment this realization settled into the room, the dynamic changed again. What had been structured prayer became pressure, as if the ritual itself was no longer simply being performed, but resisted at every conceptual step. Words that normally carried authority now seemed to encounter something that responded to them in real time, not passively, but actively, like resistance adjusting itself to the shape of the command. And in that adjustment, something else became apparent. It was learning. Not in the human sense of gradual understanding, but in the instantaneous sense described by classical metaphysics, where intelligence apprehends wholes rather than fragments. This is where the philosophical foundations of thinkers, like St. Thomas Aquinas, become relevant again. Because if such a mode of intelligence is assumed, then adaptation does not require time. It requires attention. And attention, once directed, can feel like intrusion. The priest described moments where the atmosphere itself seemed to tighten, as if the room was no longer simply space, but awareness concentrated into a single point of focus. Every movement, every pause in speech, every invocation of authority felt mirrored by an opposing response that did not come from the body alone, but from something using the body as a medium. And then came the turning point. Because during the escalation of the rite, something was said that was not part of the script. Not improvisation, but interruption. A statement that referenced knowledge so specific, so hidden, that it collapsed any remaining assumption that the encounter was purely psychological. It referenced something personal, something unshared, something unrepeatable in ordinary human communication. And in that moment, the priest's own internal structure of certainty fractured, not into disbelief, but into recognition that whatever was present understood him in a way that should not have been possible. This is where accounts from experienced exorcists begin to converge with a pattern that is difficult to dismiss entirely. Across multiple documented cases within the tradition of the Catholic Church, there are recurring reports of intelligences displaying knowledge of private details that were never disclosed in any observable channel. Whether interpreted as supernatural knowledge, unconscious leakage, or coincidence stretched beyond probability, the consistency of the claim creates tension that is hard to ignore. And that tension is precisely what defines the moment of vulnerability, because in the priest's description, it was not fear that disrupted him first. It was disorientation. The sudden collapse of the assumption that inner life remains fully inner. The sense that the boundary between thought and exposure was thinner than expected. And that perception alone, regardless of interpretation, is enough to destabilize focus during a ritual that depends entirely on sustained authority. Which is why what happened next mattered so much, because the entity did not escalate with chaos. It escalated with precision. It shifted tone. It changed cadence. It moved from aggression into something closer to control, as if attempting to steer the emotional state of the encounter itself, not simply resisting, but directing. And this is where the account becomes most controversial, because it suggests not just awareness, but strategy, a form of interaction that implies prediction, anticipation, adjustment based on response, and that creates a loop that is psychologically and theologically significant, because it turns the encounter into a feedback system rather than a one-sided command structure. The priest later described this phase as the most difficult, not because of physical manifestation, but because of the sense that he was being observed in real time at the level of intention. Not just what he said, but why he said it. Not just action, but orientation. And in that kind of environment, certainty becomes difficult to maintain, because certainty depends on stable assumptions about boundaries. But if those boundaries feel compromised, even temporarily, the entire internal structure of focus begins to shift. That is the moment where many accounts describe collapse, not necessarily of faith, but of concentration, which in ritual contexts can be enough to change the trajectory of the encounter. But according to the testimony of Chad Ripperger, what prevented collapse was not strength of will alone, but reliance on structure that existed outside the individual, a framework of authority understood within the sacramental theology of the Catholic Church, where the exorcist is not the source of power, but the channel through which it is believed to operate. And that distinction becomes critical at the moment when internal certainty weakens, because it shifts the source of stability away from perception and into structure. Which is why even as the pressure increased, something else began to assert itself in the room. Not louder, not more forceful, but consistent. And consistency, in this context, becomes its own form of resistance, because where the entity adapted, the ritual did not. Where the entity shifted, the structure remained. And in that imbalance, something began to change. not immediately, not visibly. But underneath the surface of the encounter, as if two different logics were colliding and only one could sustain itself indefinitely. And that leads into the final escalation of this part of the account. Because the entity, recognizing the persistence of structure, shifted its focus once again, this time away from resistance and toward revelation. It began to speak in a way that suggested not just knowledge of the present, but awareness of patterns extending beyond the immediate moment, as if it were drawing from something broader than the room itself. And what it implied next is where the narrative stops feeling like confrontation and starts feeling like exposure. Because it suggested that the real battle was not about expulsion at all. It was about access. And what happens when access has already been granted long before anyone realizes it. And that is where the account ends for now. Because the next part is where everything shifts again, not into resolution, but into something far more unsettling. What happens when the thing you thought you were confronting was never the thing in control of the situation in the first place?